Okay, all right. Welcome to a lecture on existentialism. Now, this is a really, I think, recent and important philosophical movement that actually had a huge impact on filmmaking. So, unlike, say, studying Plato and then looking for Platonic themes in films, which is also, something we're doing and is valuable, this is one of those interesting cases where the movement of existentialism as a philosophy happened really after and during the development of cinema. So you'll see that some of the major players in existentialism were working sort of in the 1920s and 30s and up through the 40s. And that's really the time when sort of publicly accessible cinema really exploded. So there's actually some very fun influences where once you see what existentialism is about today, you'll see that it had a big influence on things like film noir. If you look at those wonderful, detective films from the 1940s or sort of murder mysteries of that period, you'll see that the aesthetic is very much influenced by existential ideas. There's a kind of despair and alienation and angst and ennui, that's in these aesthetics that, very much was explicitly developed coming out of like German Expressionism and into, say, Hollywood film noir. They're very much interacting and reading these authors of existentialism and playing with their ideas. And so I think it's kind of fun to see that there really are existential filmmakers. So let's look at, some sort of the basic sketching of the basic ideas of existentialism, and then we'll drill down on the actual reading you did, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's essay called Existentialism is a Humanism. And let me just give you some names and dates here because if you're into this, and I think many of you will like existentialism, you'll want to go and look at other existential philosophers and literary figures. At the top of this list is Soren Kierkegaard. I suppose we could also include Dostoevsky here, the great Russian writer. These are kind of, Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky are kind of proto, and Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche too, were kind of proto-existentialists. They were hitting onto the ideas of existentialism a little bit before the philosophical movement really got codified. And Kierkegaard is a Danish philosopher, 1813 to 1855. Denmark, I've spent some time in Denmark. I really love Denmark. It's a really bizarre mix of sort of a culture that produced both Soren Kierkegaard, who was very much looking at the absurdity of life and the sort of irrationality of life, and also Hans Christian Andersen. So it's like both charming and sweet, but also has this very dark and sort of strange underbelly to it. I highly recommend Denmark. Friedrich Nietzsche, many of you will know Nietzsche's name. Maybe some of you will have read Nietzsche. He has these sort of famous slogans like, God is dead. You can see it on coffee cups and, sort of subculture bumper stickers. But Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher who lived until 1900, really had a lot of ideas that would qualify as existential. We'll get into those more later. At this point, I'm just giving a list, but we'll get into these ideas more as we go. Martin Heidegger, German philosopher who lived all the way to 1976. Heidegger's an important character because he's been very influential. His philosophy is very interesting. There's a lot of really good stuff in it, a lot of challenging stuff, but sad to say, he did become a member of the Nazi Party for expedient reasons, I think, in the 30s, and that will be a sort of permanent stain on his character. Jean-Paul Sartre, 1905 to 1980. Sartre is the French philosopher who you read for today. He was a very big public intellectual. So it's hard to describe this for Americans because Americans don't have a lot of public intellectuals. We have some of these sort of science popularizers like, Bill Nye the Science Guy or Neil deGrasse Tyson, but we don't have really famous philosophers. I suppose people might point to what's his name? I actually debated him before he was famous. Who is that guy? Oh, Jordan Peterson. Jordan Peterson has become extremely popular and famous, partly because he's massaged social networking really well. I debated him. I wrote a book about fairness back in, I don't know when that was, 2012 or something, and debated him on Canadian television. And he was a nobody, like me. He was a professor at University of Toronto, and at that point seemed very coherent, and we had a good debate and conversation. I think you can still find it online. But he's gotten increasingly strange and bizarre. But he's very famous because he's online all the time. In any case, when Jean-Paul Sartre died in 1980, the streets of Paris filled for his funeral. So it was almost like it's a kind of level of intellectual that Americans just don't. We don't have the culture for that. It's not the same. But the point is that Sartre and existentialism had a huge impact across the culture. Simone de Beauvoir was his common law wife. They lived together for decades. She is a great philosopher in her own right, and to many people is considered to be the founder of modern feminism. She wrote a book called The Second Sex, very interesting, well-argued, and complex book. She herself was an existentialist, was much more interested in the sort of implications of existentialism for the gender question. And so I refer you to her. And then Hannah Arendt, also very interesting existential philosopher, Jewish writer who's dealing largely with the Holocaust personally, and also the fallout and the sort of philosophical challenge of the Holocaust that occurred. She is a great writer along those themes. Albert Camus, more of a literary figure, but still a good philosopher in his own right, died in 1960, I believe, in a car crash. Camus might be known to you as a literary figure. He wrote some very famous little novels, one called L'Étrangère, the Stranger. He wrote The Rebel, The Plague. A very interesting writer, very existential. Okay, what are the ideas? Let's talk about the way to understand existentialism is to first figure out what it is opposing, what it's criticizing, what it's trying to tear down. It is a critical philosophy that's trying to remove 2,000 years of another philosophy, and that mainstream 2,000-year-old philosophy, well, it's older than that even, is what they call essentialism. It's a kind of metaphysical and moral view that sees the world made up of essences. And this means that there's a kind of design that's in nature. And there's many different kinds of essentialism. So you're going to have to try to piece this together. Think of it as like a family resemblance of ideas that are all sort of loosely connected to each other. And the existentialists don't like any of it. So I'm going to try to tick off different versions of it, and you begin to see sort of a pattern here. So old school essentialism said there's a kind of design throughout nature. If you look at, there's a kind of beauty in nature, and there's a kind of way things are always working in a rational way. The acorn always develops to become the oak tree. The seasons come and go. Plants basically take in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. We take in the oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. There's all kinds of weird sort of wonderful harmonic patterns within nature. And so the traditional essentialist thinker says, well, those are there because God put them there. Nature reveals a kind of inner design of essences to the way it's structured, and there's a purpose to all of it. And arguably, there's a kind of fate because God designed the world, and it's made up of essences, it has purposes, and there's a kind of way things are going to go historically because that's what God wants to happen. And if you're not a fatalist, as we were talking before, you might be a determinist. So you think there's a kind of essential determinism that would be more like chemistry and physics. And the world is made up of essential properties, like look at the table of elements. If you have a certain kind of number of atomic elements, or you have a certain kind of number of hydrogen and oxygen sort of components, you're going to end up being water. So the essence of water would be H2O. That's a way of thinking about things as having a kind of essential ingredient. And the laws of nature, like gravity and the strong and weak force, come together to create the world into these sort of predictable, definable, essential structures. All right. So that's what existentialism doesn't like, and it wants to dismantle this. And we're going to see reasons why existentialism didn't like this view. So if we look at this slide, dismantling essentialism, on the left-hand side, I try to give a definition of what is a sort of, again, a kind of family resemblance of different ideas. A belief that things have a set of characteristics which make them what they are, and that the task of science and philosophy is their discovery and expression. The doctrine that essence is prior to existence. So this is the view that these folks do not like, which is that essence precedes existence. What's sort of an example of this? Well, I had a kind of slide here of DNA, the double helix, and also a slide of the great Michelangelo's painting in the Vatican in Rome, which is God creating Adam. And you see that little touch, the touching of the fingers. Think about the creation story then as like the kind of ultimate essentialism. What does it say? It says God creates the world, then creates all these animals, and then finally creates Adam. If you remember, God creates Adam from sort of clay or mud, and then breathes life into Adam, and then makes Eve from Adam's rib bone. Now, what is happening here? Well, from an essentialist point of view, you think before Adam was an actual flesh and blood man, he was an idea in God's mind. So that idea is the essence of Adam, and therefore the essence of human mankind. So God has an essential idea of human beings, Homo sapiens, before he ever makes one of them. And that's a kind of essentialist view. So essence precedes existence means that the blueprint for Adam pre-existed the flesh and blood created Adam. And that can be seen also in other examples. Like think about a building. The essence of the building exists in the architect's mind first, and then then she basically draws it out as a blueprint. So then it exists as a blueprint, and both the idea and the blueprint are kind of the essence that exists before you actually start stacking bricks together and making a physical building. So that's what it means to say that essence precedes existence. And that, again, is the enemy viewpoint. That's what existentialism doesn't like. Now, why doesn't existentialism like it? Well, because there were things happening in science and in culture and in history that led us to have doubts about that sort of simple view of essentialism. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see some of the reasons why the existentialists were taking their cultural environment and trying to shape it into a philosophy. One thing that sort of kicked essentialism in the head was Darwinian evolution. because Darwin comes along and it's the end of special creation and the idea of these eternal natural kinds in nature. Darwin comes along and says, yes, human beings change over time. They grow and develop from babies to, adults to old people, and then they die. Darwin comes along and says radically that that's what happens to species too. You can have a whole species emerge, develop for millions of years, and then go extinct. So this was a different way of thinking about nature. We all live on the other side of Darwin, so you forget how radical this was. But Darwin's claims were very threatening to the theological view of essentialism, because from that point of view, why would God ever make things that were imperfect and that he had to destroy or remove from the creation? People couldn't understand that. When you started talking about extinction, many people were like, well, why would God, who makes perfectly and is perfect, make an imperfect world where he has to try out whole species of animals and then remove them from the creation? It didn't really make sense with the essentialism that we had theologically for really thousands of years. Then anthropology comes along and says, well, there isn't just one kind of human being with the same kind of mind and beliefs and their notions of truth and so forth. They begin to see that, all different kinds of people have different kinds of minds, and maybe there's a kind of what's, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, maybe what's true and false is in the eye of the beholder. You begin to get this radical notion of diversity in anthropology, which sort of knocks some of the ideas of essentialism down. Because essentialism says there's really just one kind of human nature, and then these little manifestations that are a little bit different. And the anthropologists come along and say, well, maybe the differences are bigger than that. Then comes big changes in physics, relativity and quantum mechanics. Now in physics, we begin to think, wait, it's not what Newton said of these deterministic systems where you have these inflexible laws and moving atomic bits around. It's actually way stranger than that. Not only do the laws are different. We get different laws in which space and time are basically manifestations of the same thing. That's very different than Newton. Then even the atoms are not the same, because for Newton, atoms were more like billiard balls or something. They just running into each other, hitting each other and bouncing off each other. You get to quantum mechanics and you get atomic sort of relationships that are just probabilistic. You get this kind of fuzzy electron that you can't even say deterministically where it is within the atom. You can't say both where it is and what its velocity or spin is. You can say one, but then the other one becomes indeterminate. So indeterminacy within quantum mechanics really makes people think that nature is not as essentialist as we thought it was. It's much more indeterminate. And then there are declines in the cultural importance of religion. Starting in the 20th century, you get slowly the reduction of religion as a very strong cultural and social force. Very importantly, the world wars created a whole generation, 2 generations of pessimists, and with good reason. Many of these people who become existentialists not only saw the World War I and World War II happen, they fought in it. They lived and died in these world wars. And so they were not as optimistic about the goodness and justice of the world as the earlier essentialists were. They were very much sort of sickened by the misery and the sort of injustices they were seeing around them. So the world wars had a huge influence on the pessimism that sort of emerges within existentialism. And then also in linguistics, changes, people start to think about language as also relative and not fixed and essentialist. All right, let's get down to the basic claim of existentialism, which, as our author says, is all existentialists are united in this one phrase, which is existence precedes essence. This is the reversal of the one we were just looking at, which was that essence precedes existence. That was the Adam and Eve version I was saying. Here they're saying, no, it's existence that happens first, and then essences come afterwards. Well, what does that mean? Let's look at these 4 claims. 1, we have no predetermined nature or essence that controls what we are, what we do, or what is valuable to us. So the existentialists have taken a radical view. They're basically saying there's no human nature, no such thing. You'd like to be able to look within your genetic makeup or look at the Bible and figure out what you are, but that's just chemistry and cultural stories. There is no such thing as a real essence that you have to discover. So they reject this idea. Number 2, we are radically free to act independently of determination by outside influences. So no matter what your genetic determinism is, or your nurturing determinism, the existentialists say you're always free to act in response to that information. You are not a machine, you are not a robot, you are not an insect, you are something radically different. You always have choices and freedom. 3, we create our own human nature through these free choices. So there is a kind of human nature, but it's something that you are building as you live your life. So they don't think that you have like a preset code of who you are, and they don't think you have a preset soul that, if you're religious, you might think, well, I have a soul, and my life story is the working out of that soul, that soul's desires and that soul's purpose. The existentialists would say, well, let's get rid of that talk about souls. But even if you want to keep it, because there were some sort of religious existentialists, they'd say what you mean by a soul is that you are building your true self as you go through life, and you do that by the accumulation of your free choices and your actions. So you are like an artist. You're not like a scientist discovering who you are and then sort of following that rule book. Rather, you're more like an artist who's composing who you are, like what your soul is, and you're doing it sort of on the fly as you go through your life. It's like you're building who you are through these choices. Number 4, we also create our values through these choices. So this is a very important point. You can't know what the right thing is to do or what the ethical thing is or what your morals or values are by just looking it up in a book or finding it in your genome. There is advice coming from these wisdom traditions. If you're Jewish, you'll look at the Torah. If you're Buddhist, you'll look at the Buddhist sutras. If you're Hindu, you'll look at the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita. So there are cultural stories that are trying to guide us about how to live right and live well. But ultimately, you have to interpret those, and you have to put those into practice. And the truest expression of your values is not your set of beliefs, but really what you do in life. So your free choices and actions really do show you where the rubber hits the road. That's where you have to walk the walk. I've got all these metaphors going here, but you know what I mean here? Like, it's easy to talk the talk. For existentialists, walking the walk is the thing. What are you actually doing with your life? That's the thing that matters. Not what you believe about your life or what you tell people about your life or what you post online about your life. All that matters is what you do with it. And these are your free choices. All right. So let's tell this example that Jean-Paul Sartre says, which I think is a great example of existentialism sort of in action. He says, now remember, Sartre actually did fight in the French sort of rebellion and resistance. The Nazis actually came in and took over Paris, and there was a sort of Nazi-dominated Vichy government in the 40s in Paris. But there were a lot of French people who were secretly fighting in the underground against the Nazis, and Sartre was one of these people. And so he's not like just sort of an egghead living in the ivory tower. He's really sort of dealing with high stakes decision making. He has but he's also a philosophy teacher, so he's teaching philosophy. And a student comes to him and says, he's got this dilemma. He says, my father is a collaborator, which means he's French, but he's working alongside the Nazis, and he's basically a traitor. And so he has no respect for his father. His brother has been killed in the war by the Nazis. And so this young man who's French says, I want to go and fight to revenge my brother and bring justice. And I want to enter, the war. But he says, my mother is the only thing I have that she has left in life. She is shattered by the disloyal traitor husband that she has. She's lost her one son to the war, and she only has this young man left. And he's saying, like, if I go off and fight, I can't take care of my mother. And what if I get killed? Then I've destroyed my mother completely. On the other hand, I really need to get revenge and fight, against the Nazis. What should I do? And so ask yourself this question: what would you do in this scenario? You really do have to try to think through it from your point of view. Many of you might say, well, stay with your mom, because staying with your mom is a known quantity. There she is. And so Sartre goes through all these options. You know your mom, you love your mom, and you can do good very clearly close to hand. Whereas going off and fighting in the war is quite an abstract thing. You might end up on the battlefield killing Nazis. You have to go to London. You might end up working in an office, typing reports. You don't know that you're actually going to be able to get the kind of revenge you want. You might also just get on the field and get killed on the first day of battle. And then your mom isn't helped and your brother isn't revenged. And so maybe stay with your mom. Then you might be thinking, okay, yeah, but what if everybody who loved their moms stayed with their moms and didn't go fight the Nazis? Well, what's going to happen is the Nazis are just going to march in and take over every damn city and country they want, and we'll all be living under a Nazi ideology. So maybe an argument here could be something like, you have to leave your loved ones in order to save your loved ones by fighting the enemy. And so there's all kinds of arguments on either side of this. What should you do? And Sartre says, so the kid comes to Sartre and he says, what should I do? And Sartre says, I don't know. I don't know. Only you can make this decision. And only you can sort of then, by making the decision, you assert your values and you make who you are in making that decision. There is no preset right decision. The right decision will be the one that you make freely and with open eyes and in a way that has been thought about. So if you look on this slide, here's some options. Like, if you're asking, like, what should I know to do? Sartre says, well, look, let's look in the Bible. Except the problem there is it doesn't tell you what to do. There's no such similar scenario exactly. And it says sort of formulaic things, like in the Bible, it says something like, always choose the more difficult path or something. Well, which one is that? It could be going to fight. It could be staying with your mom. You have to interpret the Bible. And that means you have to decide what it means. Then you basically choose it. And just looking for advice from scriptures or from religious leaders is perfectly fine, except you have to acknowledge that you still then have to interpret what that means and take it forward. So you are responsible for how you interpret it and then what you do. You can't just avoid responsibility by going to the Bible or the sutras or the Book of the Dead or whatever it is. Then you might go for your friend's advice. A lot of us do this, of course, which is get advice from my friends. But then Sartre points out, we go to friends you ever do this? Like you let's say you want some advice about what to do. You're trying to figure out, should I stay with my boyfriend, my girlfriend, or should I break up with him? And you go to ask advice for your friends, and you kind of know already what your friends think. So you kind of keep going to get to the friend who tells you the thing you want to hear, and then you say like, oh well, my friend Janet told me and gave me advice, that I should break up with him. And Janet's a smart person, and so I got to go with that. What are you doing? You're kind of like, you're sort of going through and discounting and then accepting the friend's advice that you already want to hear, and then you're hiding behind that your own free, responsible choice of whether to dump your boyfriend or not, let's say, in this example. So oftentimes the friend's advice is good to get, but you're still having to interpret it and put emphasis on it, and you establish the validity of it only through your free choice of the action. Emotional guidance, the problem with this is if you said, okay, just wait to feel what the right thing is, staying with your mom or going to fight the Nazis. You wake up and you realize, I love my mom and I've got to stay with my mom because those feelings are really strong. The problem with feelings, though, is that they change. They change from one day to the next. Hell, they change like on the same day. Your love of your mom can easily be pushed out by your taste for righteous revenge. And then the next day, it's more your mom. So feelings are not particularly reliable guides to action. You must instead take the existential leap and say, I will decide without following feelings, because there is no rhyme or reason to feelings. And reason is the same thing. He says logic and reason is on both. There's very strong reason and logic on both sides of this, which we've been detailing already. Okay. So now, when you're avoiding your responsibility, he has a name for this. He calls this bad faith. And this basically means when you're trying you want freedom and responsibility, but with freedom and responsibility comes, with freedom comes great responsibility. So we like the freedom, we don't like the responsibility. It seems to be a kind of a human condition response. And the existentialists say, look at all the ways you avoid responsibility. You try to have bad faith or become inauthentic. You blame others. This is classic. Instead of accepting your own responsibility, it's everybody else's fault. We all do this, some of us more than others. And what you're doing from the existentialist point of view is you're trying to hide your own responsibility in what happened and not face it and not accept it. And that is cowardice, and it's a sign of bad faith, and it's a sign of inauthenticity. You are not an existential hero. You're just a coward in that case, from their point of view. Avoiding commitment. Avoiding any kind of decision, like I'm just not going to decide. I'm just going to be on the fence all the time. From their point of view, this is bad faith. You have to commit one way or the other, and then embrace it and accept it, and don't keep, wondering, well, what would it have been like? That's sort of not an existential approach to life. Living someone else's expectation of you. This is also inauthentic. Some people, conform to the expectation of their parents so strongly that they don't even know who they are. Also, like, you get into romantic relationships and you're so much this other person's version of you that you're not doing or being who you are. You have to, from the existentialist point of view, try to resist that kind of inauthenticity. Gender and racial scapegoating. Some people will just sort of, bigoted people will see a person as being a kind of person. They'll be an essentially, you'll see sort of a bigoted somebody who's like, what's the term I want here? Somebody who's a sexist. Like if you have a man who thinks of women as being, sort of incompetent or lesser than, they'll oftentimes just meet a woman and they'll be like, oh, well, she's one of that kind of human being, which is unreliable or incompetent. And so in the mind of the bigot, they're taking the individual and treating them as an essential kind of thing. And they don't like that essential kind of thing. So that's sort of what racism and sexism used to be called. It was treating individuals as being types, and that you then having a kind of negative attitude towards those stereotypes. We sort of have a different system of this now and think of racism a little bit differently. But that's sort of the traditional view of racism. And you can see that it is a kind of essentialism. You meet somebody, and before you know who they are, you're saying, oh, well, they're one of them. That's a kind of essentialist dismissal of an individual. And that is bad faith and inauthentic thinking. And the existentialists hated it. And so many existentialists were very much involved in liberation movements, in sort of anti-colonial movements, in post-colonial movements, in the independence and civil rights movements. Then here, social media escapism is a kind of bad faith. Rather than sort of confront your own life, you live in this completely fictional or imaginative world of online life. Inauthenticity and the serial killer problem. This is interesting. I'm going to just quickly talk about this because it shows up in a lot of movies. If you look at movies like, a lot of Woody Allen films are very existential, and he's interested in this problem of the serial killer problem. But you'll see this also in something like, what's the great Martin Scorsese film, which is Taxi Driver. I remember when they were creating that film, they explicitly wanted to make a kind of American absurd hero of some kind, an existentialist view of life. Okay, in short, here's the sort of serial killer problem. If the goal of life is to just be your true self and to be authentic and to avoid bad faith and to really be who you are, that's really the most important thing. Then how do you prevent the existence of an existential, authentic, heroic serial killer? Because there might be a serial killer out there that knows exactly what he's about, that's freely choosing his values by killing people, and is basically being his true, authentic self. This is kind of a weird puzzle for the existentialists because they've sort of scrapped all the traditional views of right and wrong and ethics and God's 10 Commandments, and they've said you are what you do, and you make your values as you go along. Well, then what do you do about these radically antisocial individuals who are really bad for society, really bad from the point of view of killing and murder and the destruction of innocent lives, and yet they're going about it in a way that's completely, authentic. They're not hiding from it. They're owning it completely. They know who they are. The sort of these sort of really horrific characters, but also they're sort of they understand themselves in this existential way. Now, here's the way that the existentialist tries to solve this problem, and you decide whether it's satisfying or not. Sartre says, okay, the way we avoid this problem of the antisocial person is we say, when you make a choice for yourself, you are simultaneously making a choice for all human beings. In other words, when I decide to go into battle or to get married or to help this person who needs help, I am not just choosing for myself, but since there is no sort of God-given right and wrong, we humans must be choosing for the whole species. We are not just making our own history, but the human story as we go. So the existentialist says every human being is also creating the kind of species ethic as we make our decisions, as we go along. And, there's kind of interesting argument here to say this might be true, which would be something like, for the longest time, slavery was considered to be not only not objectionable, it was considered to be fine. Even people looked at, there's even passages in the Bible that suggest that it's justifiable to have slavery. And of course, we know that now that slavery is just one of the worst kind of evils that human beings can do to each other. But historically, that had to kind of emerge in over human history. You could say, well, it was always wrong from the beginning of time, and that's a kind of essential view of right and wrong. But the existentialists would say, no, societies had to slowly develop a kind of set of values that said that slavery is no longer good and we reject it as a species. And then if you look at history, you could argue, well, yeah, slavery kind of slowly went away in the 18th and 19th centuries. And so the existentialist thinks that when you make a decision, you have to think about what's ethically good for everybody. And when you make that decision like that, you would never be able to hurt innocent people, because that would be sort of then a rule that all human beings would have to follow, which is just when you feel like murdering people, you can murder them. And that's not universally tenable, so you can't do that yourself. You are bound by the laws of universal values, but you create them. I don't know how satisfying that is. I've never found it particularly satisfying. It seems like a trick of the hand here to try to get ethics back in through the back door. I'll let you assess its value. Okay, a couple of other very quick points here, and then I'll sort of list some films that you can see that are existential. But let's look at this other idea here, very crucial, which is existentialists have this idea of the absurd. The absurd is sort of a technical term in existentialism. It says life is absurd, which means it lacks coherent moral and metaphysical structure. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have a sort of built-in structure that you could find and then make predictions from. It is an incoherent place, and that means that oftentimes unjust people get rewards, and really good people have terrible suffering. Life doesn't make sense. It's just a complete shit show if you're an existentialist. And for them, absurd is sort of a way of describing that lack of rationality, but also absurd means it's kind of funny. There's sort of this dark night of the soul for the existentialists where they get depressed when they realize that there isn't this sort of God in his heaven watching out for you. But then they start to say, oh, well, then I can make the world a better place and make it what I want. So then Sartre says it becomes the ultimate optimism, because now you must sort of take this absurdity and embrace it and laugh at the ridiculousness of the world, but still love it and make it better. And that's sort of this sort of message that you see in a lot of existentialist films. This is really what happens in that film, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. It's sort of this story of the trajectory of feeling the meaninglessness of things, the absurdity of things, going into a kind of depression mode as a response to that, and then coming out the other side of that depression mode with an affirmation about the things that really matter, like love in one's family, the local good that you can do, and justice that you can do. And that's the whole existential trajectory right there. It's dip into existential despair and then rising back out with a kind of existential, heroic kind of optimism. Okay, then if we look on the right-hand side of the slide, man or human beings seen in this light is full of contradictions in the light of absurdity. And then man or human beings obviously creates himself through the choice he makes and thus takes responsibility. So that's this idea of the absurd. And then this idea of alienation is very important in existentialism too. And it's a story that Karl Marx first gets this idea of alienation from his own sort of philosophical mentor, Hegel, a German philosopher. And Marx has this idea of alienation that then gets very popular in philosophers like Nietzsche and then literary thinkers like Kafka and Camus. And the idea is existentialists are concerned with how technology shuts man out of nature, and also it shuts us out from each other and ourselves. So this is a very interesting idea. I don't think you would have had existentialism develop in a different time than the Industrial Revolution and the rise of the machines. So labor and the sort of oppression and abuses of industrial revolution led many people to feel that they were just not, they were strangers in their cities. They were strangers to themselves. And so if you look at this list, the crowding of people into cities made people like, even though we were in greater physical proximity to each other, it was like a strange anonymity. People didn't know each other anymore. Subdivision of labor. We basically before industrialism, we would have worked in collectives, and then instead you get people working in factories, like making a widget all day long, not even knowing what the machine is they're making. Government control becomes, increasingly, extensive and sort of Orwellian. Growth of advertising, propaganda, and the mass media of entertainment and communication starts to explode in the 20th century. And what Marx meant by alienation was, and you see it in all these cases, is that when you work in a capitalist system, it's not just you and your family making a boat for fishing that you and, that maybe your father is going to use when he goes fishing. You're actually making boats or cars or whatever it is for strangers, and you're with strangers in a factory doing this. And so there's this strange alienation, like you're not, as a family, you're alienated from the product that you're making. Often, you ever work a job where you can't even afford the thing you're making? Like maybe you work in a company that makes like designer clothes or jewelry, or let's say you work at Tesla or something and you can't afford the actual Tesla car. That's a strange modern form of labor that didn't exist before capitalism. And then think about this, Marx says, you work so hard that when the day is done, you have been actually alienated from all your energy. You don't have any energy to do anything but something passive, like sit and watch yet another Netflix series. So you're alienated from your own creativity and your own sort of potentiality by modern labor. And so these are very interesting ways that we're alienated from each other and ourselves, given certain kinds of labor practices. Now, the ultimate sort of symbol of this absurdity comes in the form of an ancient myth, which gets reactivated by Albert Camus, and that is the myth of Sisyphus. Some of you will be familiar with this, others won't. Sisyphus is a Greek. He's a demigod who is, I think Zeus. He basically makes Zeus angry, and Zeus punishes him by putting him in Hades, or the underworld. And every day Sisyphus has to push this gigantic boulder up a huge hill to reach the top. And it's just impossibly difficult and hard, and it's a day-long torture. And when it gets to the top, the giant boulder just rolls back down the hill, and Sisyphus has to do the exact same thing the next day. And so day after day after day, ad infinitum, for all infinity, Sisyphus is punished this way. And that is a great metaphor of the absurdity. And you think, oh, that's terrible. But Camus in The Existentialist says, that's you, that's me, that's everybody we know. You think your life is sort of going along and having progress. Oh, I'm going to college, I'm going to get a degree, I'm going to then get married or have a relationship and buy a home and then work have a great career and take vacations, and then maybe I'll have children, and then I'll die, and it's going to be a great story of progress. But the existentialists are like, yeah, but it doesn't. You don't get any rewards for this. It's all kind of intrinsically meaningless. But now here's the point: is the existentialists say, don't give in to depression, because even though you think that's depressing, there's a moment, Camus says, where Sisyphus is watching the boulder bounding back down the mountain, falling and rolling away, where he has to look down and he has to just laugh and enjoy it and like embrace it and say, this is the existential struggle. This is the meaning of life, is this sort of very local, not cosmic meaning, but very close by, triumphs and tragedies that I'm going through. So that's the sort of existential overcoming of nihilism. Nihilism means everything is meaningless. That's nihil is from the Latin, which means nothing. Everything means nothing. And the existentialist says, yeah, intrinsically everything means nothing, but the existential second step is to really sink down into the little sources of meaning that matter, the love of family, the hobby of creativity that makes your life valuable, that gets you up in the morning. It's these little things like your garden or whatever, like really take a hugely authentic, make these like life and death kinds of phenomena. And that's the existential solution to meaninglessness. All right. Existentialism shows up not just in cinema, but also in art generally in the 20th century. And so if you look at the 20th century, you will see the sort of embrace of and the sort of celebration of the absurd, the tragic, the nihilistic, the ugly, and finding beautiful in this beauty in all this stuff. And so some of the great artists of this period, Francis Bacon, Marcel Duchamp, Salvador Dali, Edvard Munch, sort of punk music as a sort of response to the meaningless and the sort of this puncturing all the sort of pompousness of official bourgeois culture. And then here's just a list of films that seem to be interested in existential themes in some way. This is not an exhaustive list, but just some things you might want to explore. 2001: A Space Odyssey, The Seventh Seal, Solaris, I Heart Huckabees, Modern Times, The Trial, The Swimmer, Easy Rider, Crimes and Misdemeanors, The Man Who Wasn't There. One of the films on the syllabus, which I highly recommend to watch, is it seems like it's just it's sort of an adventure and sort of slightly a horror movie called The Grey with Liam Neeson. And it is a strangely existential film, which I do recommend because it's about these guys sort of trapped, having to face their own deaths, and how you can do it in a variety of ways that are sort of bad faith, inauthentic, and in good faith, existential hero. And so that really is a fairly interesting film. All right, that's enough for now. Enjoy existentialism.